Hey guys, GhazzyTV here with another Path of Exile build guide video. In this one, I'm going to talk about mage skeletons. So Mage Skeletons has always been, for the last couple of leagues, a pretty solid league starter build and a very solid build across the board. And in 3.16, it kind of turned meta from a lot of people in the summoner community, and a lot of people asked me to make my version of it, which I have done. This little build guide will be followed by a full-blown written build guide in the vault page, which will be linked in the descriptions below. So do check that one out. If you are watching this video long after it has been posted, it is very likely that this video will be outdated. If so, make sure you always check the written guide, which will have updated POBs. It will have an updated section of everything that you need to know to make sure that the build you're following is up to date. So, without wasting your time, let's just dive into it. The gameplay footage that you'll see in this video is actually recorded with a super low budget during 3.16 Scourge League, and I'll be showing you in the guide will be included a low budget, a medium budget version, as well as a mirror tier high budget version, so that you get the transition stages between each type of budget that you can play with. This build is a very solid league starter approach, which I think is very comfortable, as the only mandatory unique item would be the Flesh Crafter. I do believe it was rather expensive in the early stages of this league in 3.16 due to how prominent this build was as a meta build. Now, of course, you can play with this build without the Flesh Crafter, but it is a very lackluster damage approach or damage output from the build till you get one. On the other hand, Crangle League, or as we call it, the Scourge League, is very easy to generate 6 links. So something like the Flesh Crafter that we're using right now was as cheap as 30 to 40 chaos with 6 links. Very straightforward. So first things first, I'm going to show you my current in-game gear, and I'm going to talk about the weapon first, which is a generic +1 level of all spell skills or +1 level of minion skills. It is a one-handed weapon, doesn't matter if it's dagger or wand or whatever, doesn't really matter at all for this build. No other modifiers on this weapon benefits this build except for the bench crafted trigger socket spell when you use a skill. This is to automate the obvious Desecrate Bone Offering with a life tap support, which is very important that you have on a low level here. I accidentally leveled it a few times, doesn't really matter, but just keep it on a low level. Another thing to note with this trigger is that you want to make sure your Desecrate is socketed above Bone Offering, so that Desecrate will happen before you get into casting your Bone Offering. Otherwise, Bone Offering will be tried to be casted and then will be put on cooldown, and then you try to summon your corpses, but the your Bone Offering will be on an 8-second cooldown. So make sure Desecrate is above your offering. So this weapon cost me a grand total of 1 Chaos Orb, very expensive. And the trigger socket spell when you use a skill craft was 3 times as expensive. Grand total cost for this weapon was 4 Chaos Orbs. The ring I'm using is a generic attribute resistance life ring. I benched HP. I think I paid an alch or 2 alchs for this ring. So just a bunch of resistances, get some HP, and if you need strength or attributes, get that sorted. Just to make sure that you can use all the gear and the gems for the build, and also make sure that your elemental resistances are obviously capped. Other than that, the other ring is the same deal, just a bunch of resistances and some HP. The amulet, low budget version, we're using allocated Mark of the Prey with the oil, with a bunch of attributes, in this case all attributes and strength, as well as a dexterity roll, some resistances, and a benched HP. The helmet is a +2 level of socketed minion gems instead of a +3, which would be obviously be better, with some HP and some resistances. I did find myself 9+ to Chaos Rest. It's not something that is mandatory, but in the 3.16 Scourge League, it does actually help a lot with the Scourge encounters in many cases. Gloves, again, just HP, resistances, attributes if need be. In this time I needed a bench crafted dexterity. Boots, these are the expensive version of the boots, which are not used in the recording. I use another pair of Albrons in the recordings. For the gameplay footage, this is basically what you want your boots to look like. They are crangled with +1 extra number of skeletons. I believe these cost about 4 to 5x. But without them, they cost a grand total of how much? 1 Chaos Orb. Would you look at that? They give you a % of increased strength. Actually, I gotta double check the 18 strength first. I think there might be more. Well, never mind. So they give a little bit of chaos resistance, movement speed, plus number of maximum skeletons, which is a significant damage increase. However, on the low budget, extra skeleton count isn't really that valuable. Higher budgets will increase the damage per skeleton, which increases the value of this modifier as well. It is a great modifier to have, but not something you should directly strive towards to be your initial investment. The Fleshcrafter is it's actually some lightning rest on the Crangled modifier from this one. Other than that, it's just generic 4 blue with 2 green sockets. And the most expensive piece for this build, this is basically the build you see here, is as low budget you can make it, except for this shield. The shield has a bunch of HP from a craft, some armor, resistances, but most importantly, it is a shaper base with recover % life when you block. This is a significantly important modifier to have to make your build sturdy and actually able to handle the red tier maps, but most importantly, the Scourge mechanics, and any sort of mechanics like Delirium that rushes on a bunch of enemies on top of you. Having that together with Bone Offering gives you a decent amount of block to actually recover your HP when you do so. The build is rather safe thanks to Vol Summon Skeletons and Skeletons acting as meat shields in front of your army, but it is in fact not that bad to have, and this is just another layer of defense for the build, which is very, very desirable. Other than that, we're using a generic Darkness Enthroned. In my case, I have absolutely dog shit jewels in here. For example, this one is a bit of resistances with life and minion damage when you use a minion skill recently. The other one is minion damage when you use a minion skill recently with HP. There actually is a decent amount of additional cold damage here. However, this is not a big damage modifier for some skeletons. They benefit so much more from actually having increased cast speed. And then we have a Rumish Concoction with absolutely dog shit rolls. It's absolutely terrible. Costs about 2 to 3 C right now. We have a armor increasing Basalt Flask. Keep in mind that Basalt Flask does taunt enemies on nearby when you use it, so be a bit careful when you use it. We have a simple Quicksilver Flask. I actually haven't even fixed this flask yet. It's a level 42 Seething Flask. I should change that. The other one is a immunity to bleed or dispelling bleed regen flask. That's basically the setup. Obviously, this one should have been a divine flask, and this could have been an eternal flask. Other than that, that kind of covers the gear. Gem-wise, we are using Dead Reckoning, which is the bread and butter for the Mage Skeletons. I actually leveled with this build using Dead Reckoning Jewel with a Tabula Rasa Gold Rim, and just smacked in Dead Reckoning as soon as I could. It was not the fastest, but it was surprisingly enjoyable to do, and it wasn't too slow either. So if you want to level this as a second league build, I think you can do this very well with the Tabula. Other gems we're using in this build is only the clusters. So this cluster right here is a Call to Slaughter, Feasting Fiends Renewal. I'm going to see how much they are actually going for right now and give you an idea. This is about 0.7 Exalted. However, if I take away that number and I search for this, suddenly they're about 60 chaos. This is one of the last things you would actually upgrade to your low budget build. It's rather expensive for a low budget item, in my opinion, but by taking away this number and you look at 10 plus passives, it's half an Exalted. It's not that much currency. Another thing is that you can actually drop Feasting Fiends entirely, and suddenly the jewel goes down to 10 chaos. If you look at 8 passives, they are about 50 C again. Thing is with the low budget build is that this build is finished already at level 91 or 90, which means that any level you get above that should be invested into the cluster jewel anyways, as the higher budget version of this build will want to have higher amount of passives on the large cluster. Which is kind of weird, but it is what it is. So getting a cheaper jewel is not a bad thing. Skipping the Feasting Fiends will drop this jewel down to 10 chaos, and it's not really that big of a deal. This node turns, instead of 10% damage and 10 life minion leech, it will actually turn into 10% minion damage. There's no difference. Go buy the 10 chaos one. Then we have the Blessed Rebirth. The Blessed Rebirth jewel is crucial. Keep in mind that you want to have 5 or 4 passives on these jewels. And Blessed Rebirth, these are the mandatory nodes. They do cost a bit of currency that you have to get. This will help you a lot in the higher end content where your skeletons will start to die. This will prevent that from happening. 20-25 C, perfectly fine. However, if you want to go for a little bit bigger investment in this, then add a renewal, and suddenly the price goes up quite extensively. Oh my god, okay, they actually skyrocketed now. Yeah, this is all you need. I don't really need the renewal, which is a 5% double damage. It's not a big deal. It does impact it better or bigger on the higher budget, but do just get the Blessed Rebirth and you'll be more than fine. Skill tree wise, straight up, go out here, pick up the Arcanist Dominion, get some HP, pick up Lord of the Dead, skip the mana till later. The mana mastery is actually reduced mana cost of skills, which will be required once you run a 6-link. And then we have the life mastery with the increased life and life recovery. And we pick up the minion offensive mastery for increased effective offering, which we are getting thanks to Bone Offering and Mistress of Sacrifice. Ascendancy wise, you just want to rush down to Unnatural Strength, and then you want to pick up Commander Darkness, or you can just pick up Commander Darkness first. It depends on how you want to play. This will help a lot with resistances. And the Mistress of Sacrifice is the bread and butter if your defense is scaling. The other life mastery pickup is obviously the plus 50 to life. I would recommend picking up the 50 plus life as the first life mastery. And then just move out through Retribution down here. Don't bother Righteous Decree till later. The reason we're using this is because of mana cost, which I'll cover in a bit. Pick up Grave Pact for more damage, get a hold of the Constitution for HP, and pick up Tiles for HP. And up here, we have the Death Attunement for additional Spectre for our Utility Spectre, which I'll cover in a bit. More damage, and over here we have Life, and then here we have Sovereignty, spec and increased mana reservation efficiency. Pick up both Righteous Army and the Redemptions. Do start with these 3 nodes here. Start with the Redemption. It will give you the best feeling for the build and more damage. We need Offensive Mastery just to increase crit. This will be like the absolute last thing you add. For a higher budget, it matters more, but for a low budget, it's not that much of a big deal. Don't forget to pick up Devotion. It's a big life node right there. That kind of covers the skill tree. So let's talk about the gems. I've already covered the trigger setup. The helmet that had plus level, let's talk about the minion gems. We should have our zombies in here, which acts as another layer of meat shields for you. Animate Guardian, which have not been enabled during the gameplay footage or in this build at all. The gear for the Animate Guardian, I will cover that momentarily as well, because it's very crucial to point out that the Fleshcrafter can actually cause big issues with the Animate Guardian. Other links in here would be the Race Spectre, which are also something we'll be covering in a bit. And then we have the minion life support to keep them alive. Shield-wise, to have a life tap, again, a low-level life tap support with the Sniper's Mark, which we are self-casting, and it costs 92 HP. It's not a big deal, because you're not supposed to spam it anyways. And then faster casting to make that smooth. In the boots, I'm running in Generosity, linked with a Stone Golem, but it's for the Feeding Frenzy. But the Generosity needs to be linked with Cemetery, which is one of the damage-providing auras we run for the build. Stone Golem should be linked with Feeding Frenzy to generate the Feeding Frenzy buff to increase the minion damage of all our minions. The other 4 link is a generic Flame Dash Convocation, Determination Aura, which we want ourselves, and as well as a Skitter bot support. This will apply Shock and Chill, which is used very crucial for the low budget approach, whereas in the high budget, you could arguably remove the Skitter bots for other approaches. I have a rough draft of some POBs that I'll be promoting in the descriptions below, as well as in the written guide. But there's a few details on the higher budget version where your skeletons can apply the elements rather than your Skitter bots, but for the low budget, this is how we play it. So, Spectre-wise, first things first, since your minions are temporarily summoned, and the fact that Carnage Chieftains as well as Host Chieftains no longer need life tap supported with them to actually generate their charges, it is actually, one of the recommendations is to use 1 Carnage and 1 Host Chieftain, and then having a Pale Seraphim, as well as an Arena Master, which would be the theoretical optimal Spectre setup for them. The problem is that even if you have Blessed Rebirth, which gives them immunity for 4 seconds after they've been recently summoned, you are in more cases than not going to resummon them after 4 seconds, even on harder boss fights, and therefore your Spectre count might not always, your charge count might not always get to 2 or 3 before you resummon them. That is why the POB linked in the descriptions below is actually designed and only showing 2 power charges and 2 frenzy charges. The reason for this is because I would actually recommend to use 2 Carnage Chieftains and 2 Host Chieftains to make sure that you can guarantee that your newly summoned skeletons will have at least 2 charges of each. And then if they're up for 4 seconds and then without being resummoned, they would get their 3rd charge. That would net you a better, reliable DPS than having other utility Spectres. So my recommendation is 2 of each, and if you only have 3 Spectres, drop 1 of the power charges and use 2 Carnage Chieftains and 1 Host Chieftain. That would be your best setup when it comes to race Spectre support for this build. Animate Guardian, what the fuck are you gonna put on him? Animate Guardian has, I believe it's 20% chaos resistance as a baseline chaos res. Fleshcrafter makes him then turn 40% of his life into energy shield. How to fix this would be to simply make sure that you find a Krangle during Scourge League, Krangle gear with minus 20% chaos res or close to 20. This will allow him to get rid of his chaos resistance, which is both good and bad. Now this allows him to have much more HP, and instead you can use something like a Doppelganger. Now a Doppelganger looks like this, which is a HP regen. There we go, regen 10% HP for 1 second when hit. Very, very good efficiency, but because for this to work, you want to have as much HP on him as possible. He is going to be at a risk to die towards a lot of chaos damage because he won't have any chaos resistance. So no gear can ever give him chaos resistance whatsoever. Other pieces for him would be something like a Kingmaker and approaches like this. I will, instead of going through all the gear sets and make this video super long, link in a video description in the descriptions below to an in-depth Animate Guardian video, which covers both the mechanics of it as well as gear sets. But do keep in mind that you cannot give him chaos resistance in a build using Fleshcrafter. And if you can, get negative chaos resistance somewhere along the road. So that's the Animate Guardian cover, and I think that covers most, if not everything, for this build. I will show you the POB here real quick. In the configuration, I have 2 charges used for him, setting up -50 on the elemental resistances. This is to simulate the Fleshcrafter, where making your skeletons ignore elemental resistances. And this is because the Cirrus and Shaper Guardian bosses have 50% elemental resistances. This is to counter this, so we can simulate how much DPS they're actually doing. We have used a minion recently. I'm showing the Bone Offering because the Bone Offering quality is not actually showing the DPS gain from Bone Offering, because the quality of Bone Offering is granting minions cast speed. So I've edited that in as a custom modifier, even noted it here. And to give you a display of why it's not working, if I look at the quality in Bone Offering and look at the DPS, it is not altering, even though if I'm changing this number. So I've added that manually. Pretty much covers most of it. I did actually not mention the Fortress Covenant, the Quickening Covenant jewel, so I should mention that real quick. Here's a little neat trick. If you put Covenant jewels inside your cluster jewels, the negative radius modifiers on them does not happen. So in the Quickening Covenant, you get minions increase attack and cast speed, and the suppressed spell damage. However, the notable passive skills and radius are transformed does never happen. Same thing with the Fortress Covenant. The notable passives to make them take more damage does not happen because it's in a cluster jewel, and instead you reap all the bonuses that are beneficial and not the negative detrimental modifiers. Another neat trick I can show you is that if you hover over the jewel, you can see there's 2 different windows, the left one being the actual jewel and the right one talking about the actual socket. To make sure that a jewel does what it's supposed to do for you, you can just hover on the side of the jewel like this, and it will just tell you what this socket is doing. In this case, it will tell me that this socket is now providing me with summon skeletons, can summon up to 15 mages, but also have 7% elemental resistances. And if I want to look at the actual gem or jewel, I'll have to hover over the actual jewels. That's a neat little trick to verify what these jewels are doing. You see the red text not showing the jewel radius not function. Same thing if I do it right here. So that's a neat little trick you can do. This build is extremely effective. We've killed Osiris, we've killed Awakener on the budget of the gear that I showed you, minus with a worse pair of boots than I showed you earlier in this video. The DPS is about 5 million when you have quality. Level 21, 20 skeletons is actually very cheap. You should use a Vol Summon Skeleton though, and the verdict is that a level 21 0 Vol Summon Skeleton is the better choice. They're going for about 30 chaos right now, so that would be one of the bigger purchases you want to go for. But early on, if you get a Vol Summon Skeleton, that helps a lot. You want to switch your Hypothermia for Volley, because slower projectiles actually has the same amount of damage, 19% more projectile damage, as Pierce. So you never have to change Pierce in a low budget. You only switch Volley for Hypothermia when you're switching for Clearing DPS. So Clearing DPS with this build is about 4 million. Not accurate because they won't have all those charges since you're resummoning them quite often. So it should be a bit lower than this. But that's fine because it's Clearing DPS. And for single target, you should have around 5 million Shaper DPS with this build, which is clearly shown when we play the game. And this is without having Animate Guardian buffs. And it's only calculating 2 power charges and 2 frenzy charges. So as long as you get 4 Spectres, if you don't, you have to move this down to having 1 power charge. You'll do 5 million. So there's almost no difference by losing a power charge in the low budget approach. That's kind of it. It kind of covers the low budget. I will briefly now show you the high budget version. POB, it is a pretty nasty shit show of currency that is needed for this. I will actually just quickly go through the gear. This is a mirror tier 1 with Zealotry with minion damage tier 1. Not very hard to craft, just costs a bunch of currency. You'd have to snipe a minion damage one with tier 1 with +2, and then you'd have to reforge the suffixes through 3 different ways. Normally we would do prefix can't be changed with a reforge cast or reforge attack to get the tier 1 minion, and then once we have the tier 1, you would do another benchcraft block to do the Crusader Slam Exalted Orb, and pray you get Zealotry tier 1, and if you do, then you do the trigger stock craft and you're done. If it fails, well, you've already made the item influenced. After that, you're fucked. So you get a snipe on your base if you want to make it cheap. Otherwise, it's going to cost you about 400 or 500 X to try to craft it when it's influenced. So yeah, it's expensive. There's a reason these things are very hard. The shield is actually very similar to what we're using on the low budget. It's just there to have some armor, HP, and life recovery. In this POB, you can see that it's 126. That's because I've spec'd into the Necromantic Aegis. The reason for this is because I couldn't find another way to give minions the crit multi and culling strike without this little neat trick. So if you want to see the build, it looks like this. but your DPS is not accurate for this version without showing it like this. So that's why it's there. The helmet is a very generic mirror tier Spectre helmet that I normally craft every league, except that there's a bench craft with extra skeletons, plus 3 socket minions, 25 hyper elevated, plus 4 spell crit socketed, the essence 30% more elemental damage. You know, the generic approach to it. And then the prefix is just a generic level 20 non-elevated mini damage, because we can't really reliably get better than that with a build with an item that looks like this. This is already very expensive to craft. There is one up for sale right now or for mirror service with a little bit lower mini damage, which will give you this approach with a wrong enchant actually. Then we have the Flesh Crafter. You can get the corrupted one if you want to. It's that, you know, there's not much you can do. Gloves, you should get elevated mini damage with the elevated Unnerve, and that's why some changes happens in the skills. I'm not going to go through all of the skills too much in the high budget. I'm just going to go through the expensive gear. Krangle, +1 Skelly for the high budget. Oberon, Warpath, +1 Skelly Elder, +1 Intelligence Gem, Hunter Influence Amulet. Generic rings from Delve with mini damage, with HP, Darkness Enthroned. Proper endgame jewels with live mini damage recently, cast speed as well as the extra cold damage, but the cast speed being the important one. Generic Bottle of Faith with 10% increased damage taken on Conk Ground, Fortress Covenant, Quickening Covenant, you know, the shenanigans, right? However, like I mentioned, we are using Cluster Jewels with 12 passives with increased effect, Vicious Bite, and HP. The last suffix should be either all attributes or all resistances, depending on what you need. Resistances are not included in this PUB right now. So that's basically 2 of those and 1 Feasting Renewal and Blessed Rebirth Medium Cluster, and that's generically it. It's very straightforward. You can get to about 135 million Shaper DPS with a proper high budget Mage Skeleton. I will be designing a medium body version, which is more reasonable than this, to be an upgrade from the low budget, which will be linked in the descriptions below before the video gets uploaded. All right, so that's all I have for you today. I hope you guys didn't get too bored out with a long video like this. I will hope you put your mouse over the like button and pressed it, and then subscribe for more content, and maybe leave a comment below in the descriptions. Not in the descriptions, but in the comment section. I was supposed to end the video. Right, how did I do that again?